There's this sense that you were a failed president.
I think I was identified as a failed president because I wasn't reelected.
60 Minutes has a long history of interviewing presidents.
A lot of critics of yours when you were president say that you've been a fantastic ex-president. You hear that all the time.
I don't mind that.
You like that?
I don't mind, yes.
President Jimmy Carter, who just died at the age of 100, sat down with 60 Minutes 3 times. The broadcast's first interview with Carter took place in the very last months of his presidency.
Mr. President, you recently directed your staff to make report cards on their employees. Now, in specific areas, I'm going to ask you to grade yourself, A through F. Foreign policy.
Dan, this is a little bit embarrassing because I'm highly prejudiced.
This interview happened in August 1980, just before the Democratic National Convention. Dan Rather asked Jimmy Carter to assess his presidency in real time while he was actively battling for his political survival.
I would say that leadership, reasonably good, maybe a B. I don't want to be held on kind of those scores. I'll see what the American people say in November.
5 years later, the one-term president was watching from the sidelines, and the relentlessly tough Mike Wallace did not let him off easily.
The Carter image, the political image, is that of a loser. Why?
But with time, the Carter image began to evolve.
It's been a life of good works and good reviews. So this is the Nobel.
And when 60 Minutes correspondent Leslie Stahl visited with him in 2010, he was enjoying the post-presidency in a very Jimmy Carter way.
The former president of the United States
And the First Lady.
and the First Lady sleep on a Murphy bed.
Absolutely.
Throughout it all, he spoke his mind, even when it cost him.
You know, you could have left that out of the book.
Well, I didn't try to conceal anything. I tried to put down exactly how I felt.
It's a common saying that journalism is the first rough draft of history. And when we went back to take a second look at Jimmy Carter's interviews with 60 Minutes over the years, what we found was a legacy being molded and remolded. Today on 60 Minutes, a second look, what we learned from 4 decades speaking with Jimmy Carter, the man from Plains.
Air Sunday, August the 10th, 1980, take 1.
On the eve of the Democratic National Convention in August 1980, Dan Rather visited the sitting president in the Oval Office.
To the world, Jimmy Carter is a president in some serious trouble with some very large problems. The hostages, Afghanistan, the economy, his brother Billy, his low standing in the polls, the lack of enthusiasm for him by leaders of his own party.
Carter was fighting for a second term and fighting on multiple fronts, fending off a Democratic primary challenge from Senator Ted Kennedy, while also campaigning against Republican opponent Ronald Reagan and a third-party candidate, John Anderson. Then there was Billy, Carter's controversial younger brother, who was being investigated by the Justice Department for his involvement with the Libyan government.
In retrospect, might it have been a mistake not to have sent a message clearly, publicly, to the Libyans, that if you have any idea that Billy has any influence with me, I want to make certain you understand that he does not. Looking back on it, would that not have been something that you should and could have done?
Dan, since your question is hypothetical in nature, let me give you a hypothetical answer. If I had known in March that Billy had received any sort of loan or payment or money in any fashion from the Libyans, then I should have done what you just described. Had I known that he had any sort of financial relationship with Libya, I would have made it clear to Billy and to Libya that this was a non-productive effort that might have been mounted by Libya.
Mr. President, have you suggested to Billy that he return that money forthwith to the Libyans?
I have not talked to Billy about Libya under any circumstances since the first day of July.
But Billy's dealings in Libya were hardly the only foreign affairs challenges that Carter had to contend with.
In talking about our foreign policy, the President called the Carter years the most difficult and most complicated of times, with dozens of countries struggling for independence and a voice in the world.
A little bit of context here. In 1979, the Shah of Iran was deposed by revolutionaries. Already angry with the United States for its decades-long support of the Shah, Iranian protesters were even more outraged when President Carter allowed the exiled leader to seek medical care in the United States.
In Tehran tonight, the American embassy is in the hands of several hundred Iranian students who took control after a 3-hour skirmish with U.S. Marines.
That November, a group of Iranian students demanding that the Shah be extradited stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 52 Americans hostage. And as the hostages were held for longer and longer, the issue became a bigger problem for Carter.
What would be wrong with setting a deadline, a date, for the Iranians to release our hostages, say, by October 1st our hostages have to be out, or I, the President of the United States, will consider this an act of war by the Iranians?
If we were dealing with a rational government, what you propose would be feasible. We're dealing with a group of fanatics who have violated every principle of human decency and human rights in holding 52 absolutely innocent Americans hostage, away from their families, away from freedom, away from communication with the outside world, away from medical attention for the last months. And a threat or a deadline, I'm afraid, and I believe, might very well result in the death or the injury to our hostages.
Do you believe that it would be more likely that the hostages would be freed if Governor Reagan was elected? After all, there'd be a good reason then that the Iranians might want to make a gesture to a new administration. You would have been removed as the man, as they see it, responsible for protecting the Shah. It might be a way to get it off dead center, it strikes me. Does it strike you that way?
No. But it may be that after a certain event occurs, after Ramadan this next few weeks, after the Speaker and the Prime Minister are chosen with a new modulus, some change in tone of world events, maybe our election, that will be triggered in the Iranians' minds a commitment to release the hostages. I can't predict when it will be, but I don't think the election of a certain person in our country as president will be the determining factor at all.
There were also serious economic problems. Oil was hard to come by and expensive to get. High interest rates kept people out of the housing market. Inflation and unemployment were so persistent that economists had coined the term stagflation.
Now, in your record, you promised that you'd have inflation down to 4% by the end of your first term. Fact is, inflation's running, at my last look, was 14.8 annual inflation rate. You promised you'd have balanced budgets by the end of your first term. You haven't had a balanced budget in a year. There's no balanced budget in sight. You promised that you would reform the tax system. You said that our tax system was, and I quote directly, that it's a disgrace to the human race, unquote. Tax system remains pretty much the same. You promised that you would reduce the number of federal agencies from 1,900 down to 200. There's still 1,500 federal agencies. Now, it strikes me that any reasonable person looking at that record would say that's a record of ineffective leadership.
Some of those things we attempted and could not accomplish. We've had a substantial increase in government services. We've had a substantial reduction in the number of federal employees who deliver services to the American people. We've had a sharp reduction in the deficit that's been achieved between my own administration and that of President Ford's. We've had consistent economic goals that we have achieved.
When we pointed out a string of economic failures, the President referred us to his successes in increasing jobs, cutting back on regulatory agencies, and paving the way for a revitalization of industry. He said he thought he had done a good job in holding down inflation and interest rates, considering the way oil prices had skyrocketed since he took office.
But whether the administration failed or succeeded, Carter was quick to point out that at the end of the day, Americans should look to him and him alone for accountability.
The president has a unique responsibility. You can't share it with others. Quite often your advisors are divided 50-50 on a very important issue. Sometimes your advisors are wrong. The president has the ultimate responsibility. And in order to deal with those potential crises in such a way that they don't become actual crises, there is a lonely important decision-making process that goes on within the mind of one person, the president. And if he makes a mistake in judgment that's of serious dimensions, it could affect the future of the entire world.
Toward the end of the interview, Dan Rather asked the president to do something unconventional.
Mr. President, you recently directed your staff to make report cards on their employees. Now, in specific areas, I'm going to ask you to grade yourself, A through F.
And perhaps just as unconventionally, Jimmy Carter, who was actively running for re-election, did not give himself straight A's.
I would say maybe a B or C plus on foreign policy. But I'd like to equivocate some, if you'll permit me as a politician, by saying that the maintenance of our nation at peace and strong is such a dominant factor that it may be that a more disinterested observer would give me a little bit higher grade.
You give yourself a C plus, but you think a B minus might be justified.
I think B minus. Let's say B minus.
Overall domestic policy.
Under the circumstances, I think about a B. The actual results, maybe C.
On energy specifically.
Very good. I think we've done better on energy than we had anticipated, and that's one of the great achievements of our administration, is putting into place, under the most difficult possible circumstances, an energy policy that will pay rich dividends in the future. I'd say an A in that.
And on leadership.
Well, in international affairs, our country is still a leader. On human rights, there's no doubt that we are a leader. In military strength, we are a leader. There is a growing realization in this country and in my own mind, however, that we are no longer dominant, in that we cannot enforce our will on others. That's an inevitable consequence of changing times. So I would say that leadership, reasonably good, maybe a B.
Despite that mediocre self-report card, Carter maintained confidence about his political future.
There is no doubt in my mind that in November I will be elected president, because in my entire lifetime there has never been a sharper difference between two parties and two men than there will be in 1980. The only possible time that would even approach the significance of this election was when Barry Goldwater ran against Lyndon Johnson. That was a sharp difference. The same degree of difference, even a greater difference, exists in 1980.
He was right about that. Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter were almost polar opposite political figures. Where Carter presented himself as a humble Southern peanut farmer with strong pacifist religious values, Reagan had a bit of a swagger as a former Hollywood star who ran on shrinking the government while increasing defense spending. His campaign slogan may sound familiar.
Ronald Reagan for president. Let's make America great again.
Ronald Reagan beat Jimmy Carter in a landslide that November. Carter only prevailed in 6 states and the District of Columbia. It was a stinging defeat. And the very day Reagan was sworn into office, the Iranian revolutionaries released their American hostages. Carter left Washington with his wife Rosalind and their youngest daughter Amy and returned back home to Plains, Georgia.
His Democratic Party has turned its back on him, and he acknowledges that the American people would just as soon forget the Carter years.
Coming up on 60 Minutes, a second look, what happened when Mike Wallace showed up in Plains, posing some pretty tough questions.
These aren't easy questions to ask, sitting in a man's living room, but the Carter image, the political image, is that of a loser. We spent last Monday in Plains, Georgia with Jimmy Carter, the 39th President of the United States.
5 years after the Dan Rather interview and 4 years after Jimmy Carter left office as a one-term president, Mike Wallace came calling.
Since they left Washington, the Carters have returned to a simpler life in Plains. On Sundays, they and their daughter Amy, now near college age, worship at Baptist services. The president teaches Sunday school here, frequently attended by large groups of visitors, tourists.
Have my joy fulfilled in themselves. How much joy were the disciples going to have? Not much.
Okay, you want us in there now, too?
And after church, the president patiently poses for pictures and signs autographs for folks who have stopped by to meet Plains' sole tourist attraction.
This was 1985. Ronald Reagan had just finished his first term in office, a radical departure from the Carter administration. Where Carter had prioritized pacifism, Reagan had increased military presence abroad to intimidate the Soviet Union, which he famously called the evil empire. Where Carter had invested in social welfare programs to fend off recession, Reaganomics, as it was later known, cut government spending, lowered taxes, and promoted free market capitalism.
We must continue not only into those next 4 years, but into the next decade and the next century to meet our goal of sustained economic growth without inflation and to keep America strong.
Reagan, who had coasted to re-election in 1984, had maintained his popularity and an image of strength and competence in a way that Jimmy Carter had not.
One of the personal low points of his presidential years, he acknowledges, was his collapse while jogging in a mountain marathon. You remember this, Mr. President?
Sure.
Do you think that in the final analysis, that episode did you any harm politically?
It probably did. I think that showed that I had tried something that I couldn't finish, and that I had attempted something where I didn't succeed.
And it had nothing whatsoever to do with politics or governmental affairs or...
Well, you know, politics is a matter of image, and the image that I had attempted something that I didn't accomplish, I think did have political connotations.
Carter was once again a political outsider, just as he had been when he launched his political career from Georgia.
You must be very jealous, in a sense, of Ronald Reagan.
Not really.
I'm jealous of the fact that he is... I mean, if his is the Teflon presidency,
yes,
nothing sticks.
Mine was the opposite.
Yours was the flypaper presidency.
I think that's true. When I was there was no doubt who was responsible.
Buck stops here.
I was responsible. Now there is a great doubt about who's responsible, and Reagan has been extremely successful, more than any of his 39 predecessors, in not being responsible for anything that's unpleasant or not completely successful.
Well, how does he manage that, Mr. President?
Well, he's blamed me for his $200 billion deficits. He's blamed me and Ford and Nixon for his lack of understanding of the Lebanon crisis, saying that this intelligence network was not adequate for him. He's blamed the Congress for his withdrawal of the Marines from Lebanon under, very damaging circumstances. And he has never accepted responsibility for lack of progress in Middle East peace or a lack of progress on alleviating the problems of the poor and so forth. And he's been remarkably successful in telling people, everything's okay. At least as far as I'm concerned, everything's okay.
But Carter's criticism of Reagan extended beyond accountability.
You think we're closer to war today than we should be?
I think we have let the world know that our country is no longer the foremost proponent or user of negotiations and diplomacy, and that our country's first reaction to a troubled area on earth is to try to inject American military forces or threats as our nation's policy.
Human rights under Ronald Reagan.
Well, Reagan has basically abandoned our nation's commitment to the human rights policy that we espoused.
Why? Because he's a callous man?
I think part of it was a natural adverse reaction to my administration's policies. I don't know what his motivations are, but the result has been that the world now sees our country as not being a champion of human rights, but as being dormant at best in the face of persecution.
Former First Lady Rosalind Carter took it a step further.
I think this president makes us comfortable with our prejudices.
That's not very nice. What you're saying.
But it's the way I feel, and I think it's true.
Jimmy Carter had a reputation as earnest, wholesome to a fault. But one thing we found out about him in these 60 Minutes interviews was that he also held a grudge, and his stinging commentary was not limited to Ronald Reagan. Interestingly, the 1985 story ended by addressing Carter's lingering hard feelings toward his 1980 Democratic primary opponent.
Was that a bitter time for you? And does any of that bitterness remain toward Ted Kennedy?
Well, I don't think, maybe bitter is the right word. We didn't feel, and I still don't feel, that Kennedy had any reason to challenge me as an incumbent Democratic president and therefore destroy the unity of a party which is so crucial. And about the only time the Democratic Party has a chance to be unified is when there's an incumbent Democratic president.
By running for president, Senator Ted Kennedy was following in the footsteps of his late brothers, John and Bobby, but challenging an incumbent in a primary was a defiant move.
And I think that the primary season with Kennedy never giving up even until the convention assembled gave us a tremendous obstacle to overcome in the fall election. But I think that it would be highly unlikely that Ted Kennedy would ever be approved as a potential president by the American people.
And 5 years after losing the general election, Jimmy Carter had still not forgiven Ted Kennedy. 30 years later, Leslie Stahl met Jimmy Carter to take stock on how things had changed. That's next.
When all is said and done, and many will be surprised to hear this, Jimmy Carter got more of his programs passed than Reagan and Nixon, Ford, Bush 1, Clinton, or Bush 2. When American citizens get this book, what do you think is going to surprise them the most?
I think the absolute unadulterated frankness of what I had to say.
Before she became a 60 Minutes correspondent, Leslie Stahl had covered the White House for CBS News, including the Carter presidency.
As the president was returning from Camp David this morning, his top military, intelligence, and diplomatic advisors were meeting in the White House Situation Room, going over the steps President Carter will announce in his speech. But one top official told CBS News that the president will make no dramatic announcements tonight, and other officials described the speech as restrained.
But even she was surprised by some of the things the former president revealed when he published his White House diaries in 2010.
Well, I didn't try to conceal anything. I tried to put down exactly how I felt.
Stahl spoke with the then 85-year-old Carter from his home in Georgia.
If there's anyone Mr. Carter fumes over in his diary, it's Ted Kennedy, his nemesis. Here's what he wrote when they clashed on health care. Kennedy, continuing his irresponsible and abusive attitude, immediately condemned our health plan. He couldn't get 5 votes for his plan. He drove you up the wall.
I don't know if I ever got up the wall.
But his comments on Kennedy are harsh, even now, after his death.
The fact is that we would have had comprehensive health care now had it not been for Ted Kennedy's deliberately blocking the legislation that I proposed in 1978 or 79.
And you blame Teddy for the failure.
Exactly.
Health care, his issue.
Exactly. It was his fault. Ted Kennedy killed the bill.
Just to spite you? Is that that's the implication?
That's the implication. He did not want to see me have a major success.
Stahl asked him about the late 1970s when the energy crisis was creating mass unrest and even riots.
He writes that his own loyalists asked, "Can you govern the country?" And he tells about a brutal meeting with his cabinet. They told you that you had an image of weakness. You write that they told you this.
Sure, and they
did.
A
lack of esteem in the public eye, and they just beat up on you.
I think they were telling me that the public image of me was that I was not a strong leader, that I should not only arouse support from affection, but also from fear.
So did you change? Did you start to operate from fear?
Maybe a little bit.
Eventually, Carter's entire cabinet and senior staff offered their resignation, and Ted Kennedy decided he would make a stronger Democratic presidential nominee.
You write angrily, he's my age, but unsuccessful. He was kicked out of college. You know, you could have left that out of the book. You went at each other.
Well, you know, I felt like he went after me. I was the incumbent president. I didn't go after him, but he decided that he was going to replace me as a Democratic president.
And of course, Carter had not forgotten Ronald Reagan either.
About Reagan, you said, if I had been president for 4 more years, we wouldn't have had a resurgence of racism and selfishness. Now, that's pretty pointed. That's an ouch.
Yeah. I don't remember when I said that, but I can't deny that I felt that way.
But are you suggesting that he stoked racism?
No, I'm not.
But that's what that kind of suggests.
But there may have been times when I was too outspoken in criticizing an incumbent president. I can't deny that.
It wasn't all that surprising when President Carter stood slightly apart from Presidents George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, and Bill Clinton when posing for a photograph with President-elect Barack Obama in January 2009.
He chided Bill Clinton over Monica Lewinsky and called George W. Bush the worst president in history. And when George Bush Sr. was in office, Carter wrote a secret letter to the UN calling on the Security Council to vote against the resolution to go to war against Saddam Hussein. To write and ask UN security members to vote against the United States.
I also sent a copy of the same letter to President Bush.
Well, I'm sure he loved reading that.
Well,
but did you go too far?
I felt very deeply about the fact that the war was not necessary.
So you don't regret that?
No.
At this stage in his life, when he was 85 years old, he was commuting between his home in Plains, Georgia, and an apartment at the Carter Center in Atlanta.
By the looks of it, he's a no-frills ex-president, too.
A Murphy bed. And this is it here.
No.
Yeah.
The former president of the United States.
And the First Lady.
And the First Lady sleep on a Murphy bed?
Absolutely.
Oh, my God.
The Carters had always been frugal, and decades later he insisted that in the long term, Americans would appreciate his values and what he'd accomplished.
Carter argues that despite the image of failure, he actually had a long list of successes, starting with bringing all the hostages home alive. He normalized relations with China, brokered a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, deregulated railroads, trucking, airlines, and telephones, and his energy conservation programs resulted in a 50% cut in imported oil, down to just 4.3 million barrels a day.
Unfortunately, now we are probably importing 12 million barrels a day since part of my energy policies were abandoned.
Well, and you built solar panels on the roof of the White House.
That's right, which were ostentatiously removed as soon as Ronald Reagan became president. He wanted to show that America was a great nation, so great that we didn't have to limit the enjoyment of life.
And the public seemed to like that better. And they liked your message, which was we have to be limiting.
That's right. America responded to that quite well.
But when all is said and done, and many will be surprised to hear this, Jimmy Carter got more of his programs passed than Reagan and Nixon, Ford, Bush 1, Clinton, or Bush 2.
I had the best batting average in the Congress in recent history of any president except Lyndon Johnson.
And while Carter was associated with conflicts like the Iran hostage crisis and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, he defended his decision not to go to war.
We went through 4 years. We never fired a bullet. We never dropped a bomb. We never launched a missile.
Because of your religious views?
That's part of it, because I felt that our country should be, as a superpower, the champion of peace.
And some people will criticize that, have criticized that attitude, as saying that in Jimmy Carter's time we didn't look as strong. We didn't look like a superpower.
There's no doubt that usually a president's public image is enhanced by going to war. That never did appeal to me.
But by the time Leslie Stahl interviewed Jimmy Carter, it was his post-presidency that was earning praise. The Carter Center had become known for its role in promoting human rights around the world. and Carter became closely associated with his work building homes for Habitat for Humanity. And in 2002, he won the Nobel Peace Prize.
It's been a life of good works and good reviews.
So this is the Nobel.
Leslie Stahl's report finishes with images of the former president and his wife Rosalind appearing quite content, riding around their neighborhood on three-wheeled scooters.
Now, if you happen to be in Plains, Georgia, you just might catch a glimpse of the former president and first lady swerving along the back roads in their latest form of exercise.
Yeah, but it's a tricycle, Mr. President. You're on a tricycle.
They call it a trike, yeah.
It's been a good life, and if the Carters were in despair 30 years ago, they are now very clearly at peace with their lives and their legacy.